Good evening. Welcome to the 2019 GAWL Legislative Preview. My name is Carol Davis. I'm the VP of Public Affairs for the Georgia Association for Women Lawyers, and I am the manager of internal communications here at Troutman Sanders. And before we get started, I want to introduce to you Linda Blair, who is our manager of diversity and inclusion.
Good evening. We are so excited to have you here at Troutman Sanders. Troutman Sanders has been a strong supporter of GAWL for many years. I am the manager of diversity and inclusion, and as a part of that, I work with Carol to make sure that we continue the programming, we continue the relationship and the partnership that we have with GAWL. We are really excited that this year we will be making a GAWL membership available to every woman attorney at the firm. So you should be hearing from other Troutman women soon in various capacities as they start to learn more about GAWL, and we can bring in some of the leaders from the organization to help get them up to speed, learn what you do, how you make a difference in the state of Georgia. So again, welcome. Thank you so much for coming out and supporting the program. And thank you, Carol.
Thank you. Thank you, Linda, and thank you to the firm for the support and for the sponsorship of GAWL. I also want to thank our Public Affairs Committee for putting on the event, and Jakima Basco, who you all here in the room have met. She's the chair of Public Affairs this year. And last but not least, I want to thank all of our panelists for joining us. We have here Laura Colbert as the Executive Director for the Georgians for a Healthy Future. We have Shenna Morris. She is the Policy and Community Engagement Director at the Georgia Coalition Against Domestic Violence. Jennifer Owens is the Deputy Director at the Georgia Budget and Policy Institute. Helen Robinson is the Director of Advocacy at the YWCA of Greater Atlanta. And Laurie Vickery will be joining us here in a few minutes. She is the Chair of the Women's Trial Lawyer Caucus of the Georgia Trial Lawyers Association. And we welcome all of you here. I'm excited about the conversation that we're going to have tonight. GAWL is a statewide organization, and we are streaming this event to several of our chapters. So welcome to the chapters as well for joining us, and individuals who are tuning in remotely. When you are on the other end in the remote location, please do mute your mics to prevent any unnecessary feedback. And with that, and later you'll have a chance to submit questions via chat. So you can put that through and we'll see them, and you'll be able to contribute as we go through the question portion later in the program. So first, to get started, I wanted to start with, so GAWL's mission is to enhance and to the welfare and the development of women lawyers in our state. And I am wanting to start off this discussion with our panelists by talking about what issues that you are working on now that will affect women lawyers in our state. And I thought it would be great, Shenna, if you could lead us off.
Oh, it's already on. I don't have to push the button. Don't follow the directions. Sure. So some of the issues that the Georgia Coalition Against Domestic Violence is anticipating working on in this upcoming legislative session that would be relevant and have some impact on women lawyers is the issue around particularly firearms and mirroring the federal statute language for those who have perpetrated acts of domestic violence to not be able to own or possess a firearm if they are convicted of a misdemeanor domestic violence offense, or if they are the subject to a permanent protective order. So that is one of the issues that we are anticipating continuing to work on in this upcoming session. We've been working on that for a number of years here now. And then we also will be working to expand the definition of family violence here in Georgia so that it is one that is more inclusive, particularly of dating partners. As you all may be aware, the way that the current statute stands, there are relationship qualifiers where there maybe has to be a child in common, folks have had to live together, but that doesn't always necessarily capture those who are in dating relationships. So I could very well see where those two issues in and of themselves would be issues that would impact the work that you all are doing.
Thank you. Laura, I know that there's a lot that's going on right now related to healthcare. Can you share with us kind of things that you think that our members should be focused on?
Yes, so I imagine we'll get into the details here in a little bit, but the two main things that Georgians for a Healthy Future will be focused on in the upcoming months, one is non-legislative, but it's important enough that I felt it was, we mentioned it during the legislative preview for you all. Governor Kemp has introduced two plans to change Georgia's Medicaid program and Georgia's private insurance system. These plans are not workable for Georgia or the families and consumers that live here in the state. I imagine that some of the trial lawyers here represent either low-income families who have Medicaid coverage, or you may also have individual coverage yourself through the ACA marketplace, in which case both groups of people would be impacted. Georgia's missing a huge opportunity with with Governor Kemp's plan around Medicaid to cover far more people at a much more affordable rate than he's proposing. On the private insurance side, the plan really gives a lot of gifts to the insurance companies and puts a lot of risks back on consumers in a way that the Affordable Care Act tried to roll back 10 years ago. The other thing that we will be very focused on, which would impact anybody with health insurance here in the state, is behavioral health parity, which is the requirement that insurance companies treat mental health and substance use services just as they would physical health services. And there's a federal law that requires insurance companies to do this, but we've learned that it's pretty complicated and that states are not great at implementing and enforcing the law. And there's a real need for Georgia legislators and Georgia agency officials to take a look at that and figure out how we can implement it better here in Georgia.
And I understand, Jennifer, some of those are things that your organization is also going to be looking at. Can you share with us kind of what you're looking at, what your approach will be, or your perspective on those issues, and then any others that you wanted to share with the group?
Sure, thank you. Again, thank you for being here. I appreciate the opportunity. My organization, the Georgia Budget and Policy Institute, really looks at things through a fiscal policy lens as well as an equity lens, and also statewide. And so we do a lot of diving into the data to understand how proposed policies will impact low-income communities, communities of color, and also communities in parts of our state that aren't necessarily on the tops of the headlines of the newspaper or top of mind for some of our more populated parts of the state. I would say the biggest issue we have going into legislative session is looking at the state budget, which has been coming out of some pretty deep funding cuts after the recession ended. And going into this budget year, the governor has called for some pretty steep cuts to programs that I think everyone in this room and everyone paying attention is going to feel in some way in their community. Things like massive cuts to the reentry program as part of the criminal justice reforms that we've been so proud of as a state that the Governor Deal championed. Some pretty significant cuts to the child welfare program, particularly in the staffing side of things. So looking at caseworkers that are going out to do the site visits and have kids in care, that caseload increasing and those staff numbers decreasing, just as an example. and also funding meant to raise up priorities that I think we probably all share, specifically around how to address the maternal mortality rates we have here in the state. So the budget situation is interesting in that we're in a good economy, and yet we are facing some pretty deep funding cuts and austerity, if you will. We're coupling that kind of situation also with calls to further cut taxes for top earners in our state at the state level, and that's something that we'll be watching really closely, because all of this put together, the budget cuts as well as two potential massive tax cuts for top earners, will really eat into the state budget in ways that we'll feel for decades to come. So I would say that's the top issue that we're looking at. I want to come back to Laura, who's been a great partner to us on the healthcare front. We're going to be releasing an analysis of how much the healthcare proposal costs the state and how many people are going to be covered. Right now, our early estimates is that it's going to cover about 1/10 of the people full Medicaid expansion would, at nearly double the cost to the state, and also forego the opportunity to draw down on billions of dollars of federal funds that are meant for states to spend to help expand their Medicaid programs and cover the uninsured. So look for that in the next couple of days. What's great about this process is that there is a public comment currently underway. So while the legislative piece was largely done this last session, there's a public comment process happening right now, and I'm sure Laura's going to talk about that. And I'll just mention three other things in terms of priorities. We focus on healthcare, K-12 education, early education, higher education, workforce, the safety net, and taxes and budget. So we've got a pretty wide policy agenda. We are really excited. There's a bill, House Bill 588, that's sponsored by Representative Houston Gaines out of Athens, that actually looks at cutting taxes from the bottom up as opposed to the top down. And this is something that we've had a lot of research, and many of the women sitting up here have been working with us on for several years. Really excited about moving that proactive piece of legislation. Also looking at ways to make college more affordable. 2 years ago, the state passed a need-based aid program. The HOPE programs are largely merit-based and therefore really leave a lot of low-income students still struggling to be able to afford post-secondary education. We passed a need-based aid program, we just have not funded it yet. So looking at opportunities to be creative with funding to make sure that students have access to go to college without going into deep debt. And then also looking at ways to drive a little bit more equity into the way we fund our public schools. And in particular, looking at ways to help districts that serve a high number of low-income students, that also the data shows are primarily students of color, to make sure that they have extra funding to provide wraparound services and do other things that the school districts need. Georgia is one of a very few number of states that don't already accommodate for that in our funding formula, and we're really hopeful to make a case and hopefully have a conversation with education policymakers to move that forward.
Helen, can you share with the group, I know that you all also are there's some touch points with what has been shared by all of the speakers so far, and we'd love to hear kind of what you will focus on in addition to that, but also feel free to kind of continue that conversation about the other issues as well.
Great, thank you very much. And at the YWCA, we work across all these issues of anything that impacts women's health, safety, and economic empowerment. And we run a program called the Georgia Women's Policy Institute. It's a year-long intensive training program where we bring women to the state capitol and teach them how to be highly effective advocates to change state legislation that impacts women. Actually, we have a current fellow here today. Natasha Aladina is a woman lawyer and a GWPI fellow, and we often do have women lawyers taking part in that program. And I want to tell you first the three projects that they are going to be focusing on in 2020. First of all, speaking of the high maternal mortality rate in the state of Georgia, we are going to be looking to extend Medicaid coverage for women to 12 months postpartum. So right now, if you get Medicaid as a pregnant woman, a low-income pregnant woman, your Medicaid will disappear 60 days after birth. And we all know when you look at the maternal mortality data that very often the preventable deaths are happening long after that. They're happening up to a year after birth due to complications and unmanaged chronic disease. And so that is separate from, it is a separate issue but very related to the other Medicaid-related issues. We are also going to be part of a coalition working to eliminate the discriminatory state sales tax on feminine hygiene products. So in our state, anything that is a necessary medical device is not is not subject to state sales tax, and we believe that feminine hygiene products should fall into that category. And it's a perfect example of an issue where if women were making the decisions and women were the leaders at the table, that would have happened a long time ago because it's obvious. But we have to show up and make that point. And related to that issue is that's period equity, is what we call that. Related to that is period poverty. And there are women and girls across the state who cannot afford the products that they need to go a full school day or to get through the work day. And we are also working with a lot of partners across the state to try to make products more available to women who need, to the 51% of the population that needs them. And finally, we're going to be partnering with Shenna on this one, but we are looking at a bill that would clarify that law enforcement should arrest the dominant aggressor when responding to family violence calls. Unfortunately, we too often see dual arrests happening when a woman calls the police. When the officer gets there, there was potentially a scuffle, and maybe the woman was the first initiator of something, but then she received extreme injury. And so they would arrest both because our current law says the primary aggressor, which in Latin means the first. And so we want to just simply clarify for law enforcement by simply changing the word primary to dominant that we want to arrest the person who is causing the greatest threat, the greatest physical harm. And we'll be looking forward to seeing if we can get that done. A couple of other things I'll briefly mention. We had a bill last year that the Georgia Women's Policy Institute got a hearing on in the House that we think you all would be very interested in. And I brought an article from the Atlanta Journal-Constitution over here if you want to take it home with you about this. But unfortunately in Georgia, we have really inconsistent policies across the counties about how juveniles are shackled in court, in juvenile court. We are simply asking through this bill that there be an individual risk assessment made of the child, and that there not be an across-the-board policy to shackle children as young as 10 to 12 who maybe stole a pack of gum or something like that, being shackled at their wrists, even ankles and belly chains. It's traumatizing for children who may be involved in the system because they have been traumatized already by adults. And so I think that's something that we could really use this organization and the women in this room to help us push that one across this year. And as you know, this is going to be the second year of a 2-year legislative session, so bills that were introduced in 2019 are still viable for passage in 2020. And then the last bill I want to mention that I think is of specific interest to this organization is we are also part of a coalition working to encourage employers to provide reasonable accommodations to pregnant workers. And so this simply means, it could mean being able to sit on a stool instead of standing at a cash register. It could mean taking a bathroom break once an hour or something like that. Anything that you need to have a healthy pregnancy while you're working. And unfortunately, our state does not currently have any protections along those lines. And I'll be happy to answer more questions about that as we go forward.
Thanks. Laurie, so tell us what the Georgia Trial Lawyers Association is going to be looking at this year. As many lawyers in this room, I think it will be great for us to know what is on the horizon and being looked at by the group.
I think that there are potentially a lot of things on the horizon that the Georgia Trial Lawyers Association would be concerned with coming up this year. We saw signs of some of these initiatives last year beginning, but basically what we're looking at are those things that generally there are corporate organizations that are arguing that when people have been injured due to no fault of their own, that perhaps there are new measures that need to be put in place to limit damages that people may be able to recover or change the amount of damages that they may be able to recover when they have been injured due to no fault of their own. So I think that there are several different measures that may be upcoming this year. I'll focus on a few of them. The first would be admissibility at a civil trial of whether someone was wearing their seatbelt. there were both Senate and House versions of this bill last year. Our concern is that the current law prohibits admissibility of seatbelt evidence. You all have probably passed through many rural areas or more rural areas where you see the signs about, 97% of people were wearing their seatbelts today, 98% of people were wearing their seatbelts today. Well, the statistics do show that greater than 98% of people Georgians routinely do in fact wear their seatbelts. So what problem really is being solved by the introduction of this legislation if that number of people are wearing their seatbelts? The failure to wear a seatbelt is only a $15 to $25 fine. So this is not creating an enormous amount of additional income that would be coming into our law enforcement, and it could create unintended consequences for people who, for example, are occupants of vehicles where the driver wasn't wearing their seatbelt, and somehow now that driver is at fault. And so I think that there are a number of reasons. And in addition to that, it could increase the cost of litigation because that would be yet one more piece that would be litigated in an otherwise a rear-end car collision case, for example, where there should be nothing to litigate about who was at fault for the collision. And then we'd have seatbelt experts all of a sudden that we would all need to pay for as trial lawyers, or that would come out of the advance costs that would potentially go to a plaintiff or an injured person in the case. Another major issue that we see facing is the potential for elimination of the collateral source rule. It's also sometimes called the phantom damages law. It's been in place in Georgia for 100 years now. Basically what that is seeking to do is to limit the injured person's recovery to only the amount that either their health insurance company or they have paid out of pocket, versus the total amount of their bill, which is the current law as it stands in Georgia. As we all know, and you all have been talking about, health care varies widely amongst who it's available to. I have clients coming to me on a daily basis who either have health care, don't have health care. Some have ERISA plans that are subject to reimbursement. Others have Medicare that needs to be reimbursed. It's really a quite complicated scenario, but all in all, the effect of this legislation, if it goes through, would be that it would punish people by limiting their recovery to whatever negotiated rate an insurance company has, for example, made with a hospital or a certain health care provider, versus or a third party who the injured person had no control over whatsoever. And even with those who have little to no access to health insurance, so it would be curious to see how that would end up playing out for them as well. And actually what I think that would end up happening would be punishing the people who are the responsible premium paying people who are injured in collisions, even if, I'm a self-employed person. As a solo practitioner, have my own policy that I pay for. I would then be subject to whatever negotiated rates that I have, even though I pay a pretty good premium and a pretty high deductible for the policy that I have myself. So I think that those are the people who would end up actually being punished by the passage of that law. Lastly, I'll just mention the negligent security of premises bill, which is a new concern that's been raised by one of the Senate study committees. The concern is that Georgia already has some of the strictest laws nationwide about the security of premises and whether or not there's criminal activity on a premise, who has knowledge of that, how that can be apportioned to different parties, and then the injured party can then have their judgment or verdict reduced by the amount that the other person has been apportioned their fault for that. There are some large verdicts. They appear large in size. The Six Flags verdict is one that is brought up, but they are cases that usually have extremely bad facts involved, and it's one of those situations where if a client comes to me, people would say, I never thought I would sue or ask for money for this until this happened to my family, and I think that that's something that people should consider when we think about caps and damages and changing the way that we want to structure our legislation and our laws in Georgia. The thing to notice as a follow-up to that is that nobody actually ends up paying the entire judgment most of the time, because there's an appeals process that's involved in the apportionment issue that I talked about. And then there are also high-low agreements normally, or that are pretty commonly entered into in those types of cases, where you can agree before the case even goes to trial or reaches a jury that, you know, this is the maximum that you can recover, this is the minimum that you can recover. And so the big verdicts that are often publicized aren't actually what, you know, translates in terms of what is paid. And lastly, I would argue that for the 6th year in a row, Georgia's been named the #1 state in which to do business. And so in terms of these sorts of, I guess, tort reform laws or litigation, that's something to keep in mind, that Georgia's actually faring quite well in terms of our economy and our commercial status and insurance policies. So be happy to take any other questions.
Thank you. I have a question for the panel generally. What do you see as some of the barriers to kind of moving the needle forward on the issues that you're working on?
I'm happy to start. It's that we only have 31% of the state legislature are women. So it should be, what should it be? At least 50. I would say 51. Sometimes when I ask that question, a woman always yells out 100. I'm good with that as well. But that is the problem. And I'll go back to what Laura was talking about a little bit earlier with the new healthcare waiver plans. You know, I'm reading in the paper about it, and someone is bragging about the fact that you will now be able to buy a subsidized health insurance plan that doesn't cover maternity care. And they're so excited that men will save money. Who will not save money? Who will pay more? Women. And so women as advocates, and then women running for office, and women sitting in the seats pushing the buttons, yes or no, need to be involved in these decisions, because whether it's intentional or not, women's concerns can sometimes be left to the wayside.
I would say, money is an obvious one for our work, right? But I'll offer sort of a different way to think about it too. You know, we frame a lot of our work in sort of this people first or people powered prosperity framework, and I appreciate that the state has been named the #1 place to do business, I think 7 years in a row now as of today. We just received that again, and that's wonderful and should be part of it, but it cannot be the single sole priority. We cannot be a great #1 place, best place to do business, and be a horrible place to have a baby or raise a child or send a kid to a public school in Worth County. We need to sort of shift the priority into a little bit more balance, frankly, to put people in a little bit more of the driver's seat, to control their own destiny, and that looks a lot of different ways. That looks like having access to funds to be able to go to post-secondary education so you can get a better job. That means having access to transportation to get to the better job on the other side of town. That means having access to afford childcare so that you can go to work. There's just for me, it's a prioritization issue. Business and being a good place and having a good economy is part of the equation, but it is not the entire equation. And I would say that's a huge barrier for us in our work. And the healthcare proposals are a perfect example. These proposals will benefit health insurance companies and brokers far more than they will benefit uninsured people, people with high premiums, or the state budget for that matter.
Yeah, we are the number one state in which to do business, but we are the 48th state when it comes to people, the percent of people who are insured. We have 1.5 million uninsured Georgians, and part of that is because our state does not prioritize people as much as it might businesses.
I would say for some of the issues that we are working on is one, the view of violence in this very binary way, particularly when you look at things like the expansion of dating violence, the definition of dating violence, just how, it's not very inclusive, but relationships and violence is looked at in this very binary way. And then also people only looking at survivors through the lens of their experience of violence and not necessarily considering the other intersecting identities that survivors have. So I think about the work that is being done on the feminine hygiene products and how that is something that we at our coalition are also supporting through that coalition's efforts. And then of course, just with the firearms issue, just the complexity of dissecting that entire thing and having that dialogue, I feel like are some of our very large barriers.
And I guess for me as a trial lawyer, my biggest issue would be debunking this perception that it's one party that the trial lawyers are standing for versus both, and that it's really important for all of us at this point, which I think we can agree we're in a fairly divisive society politically right now, but learning how to work together towards certain initiatives. I think that's happened, particularly with respect to working with the governor's office and the plant that was releasing the carcinogens, and I think that there have been a lot of people who have been able to work together to come up with a solution in that particular situation, and I'd like to see that sort of thing happening more frequently.
That's a great.
And to carry on with this, what we are, most of the folks here in attendance are lawyers, and what can we do in particular to help you as individuals and as an organization to help move the needle on these issues?
Good. I would say support us in, advocacy efforts, such as when there are action alerts that are released, and we're calling upon folks to mobilize and raise their voices around these issues, to reach out to your representation. Stop Violence Against Women Day for the state of Georgia is going to be held February 4th. So engaging in that particular event and attending, showing up, I think is very important, and just remaining informed and staying at the table as you are doing now, I think is very key.
I would echo that. I mean, I think as lawyers, as people who've gone through law school, you all are in a very privileged position to have a sophisticated understanding of policy and law, to the extent that a lot of Georgia voters and constituents don't. So to the extent that you have the time and energy to engage with your elected officials, your state and federal elected officials on issues of importance to you and of importance to your clients, that is really, really important. I will take 1 second to mention the current public comment period on Governor Kemp's healthcare plans. So because of the way that they are seeking changes in healthcare, the state is required to have public comment periods for each plan, both at the state level and at the federal level. The state public comment period just opened on Monday, so this is fresh and new. The plans are fresh and new, and we're all trying to read through them as quickly as we can to understand the impacts. As we've mentioned, these plans do not meet the needs of Georgia families, of Georgia consumers who are purchasing their own health care coverage, of really the healthcare system across the board in Georgia. So you can go to coverga.org and read a little bit about the plans and also submit comments there. We also have some fact sheets up front about the plans and spelling out kind of how you can submit your comments online. And there are 6 in-person public comment periods over the next, really starting tomorrow in Savannah, and then 5 other dates over the next 2 weeks. And so we would encourage you all to either attend, or again, you can submit online if you have the time and energy.
And those comments don't go in a black box, and I feel
Right.
like that's really important.
Yeah, the comments are actually they are part of healthcare law, and the state has to demonstrate that they are responsive to those comments. In states where they have not been responsive to the comments, those healthcare plans have been put on hold by the courts. So public comments are a very powerful tool in this particular moment, and so the more comments, the better. And if they and especially if you have a personal story about how these plans impact you, or again, people that you represent.
This sounds good. And I'll just add, there is a Savannah group on the so let's
wow,
just tell them.
yeah.
Let's just tell them. It's at the
Savannah.
Mercer School of Medicine.
Tomorrow,
because I know you don't have anything to do. 9 a.m. is the 11:15 waiver, which is your
That's the Medicaid waiver.
1 p.m. is the 1332 waiver, and that's the one that I was speaking to, where it's going to allow the subsidized insurance plans that don't cover the essential health benefits, which include maternity and infants health care. And I would just add that I always like to make sure you all know how powerful you are, and that when you're part of an association like this with the name that you have, you really can make a difference. And the ability to say that you're statewide, I am always excited whenever I get to talk to a statewide organization, because that brings power. All too often, if you're just representing Atlanta, you're not taken as seriously at our state capitol, but you all can come with that group. Whatever your group officially decides to get behind is one thing, but then if you as an individual want to get behind something else that we're talking about, just connect with one of us. But you really do have power. Your voice can really make a difference. There are not that many people coming down who know what they're doing and are making their voices heard on some of these issues. And so, know your power.
I'll co-sign to all of that. I would say that coming down to the Capitol is great, but sending an email like today or tomorrow or this weekend when you're in front of the TV and you just want to say, hey, I learned about an education issue, or gosh, there's 32 kids in my kid's kindergarten class. That seems pretty high. Is there something that we can do about that? Whatever it is that is an issue to you, sending an email to a state lawmaker. I have heard this over and over again throughout my 16 years at the state capitol. If a lawmaker gets an email or a phone call from 3 constituents, they feel like that is a big deal. And I'm talking about like a real email. The action alerts are great, the form emails are great, but don't do those instead of just a real personal, my Representative Holcomb is my representative. Representative Holcomb, there's 32 kids in my kid's kindergarten class. What is happening here? Is there something we can do about it? So I would really encourage you to set a goal for yourself between now and the end of the year to know who your state legislators are. There's 2. You've got a state senator and a rep. I'm happy to help you figure that out tonight. And send them an email, even if the email is just, I'm Jennifer Owens and I live in your district. I'm just starting to learn about public policy and just wanted to know that you're going to be hearing from me in the future. That can be really, really powerful.
I'm again adding ditto to all of that. I would just say that in addition to that, make sure it's very easy to go online and figure out who your representative is, who your senator is, both on a state and federal level, and connect with those people. As lawyers sitting in this room, not all, particularly with the Georgia legislatures, a lot of them are not attorneys, and they can benefit from some of the information that we convey to them about how a particular bill is written or how it may be enacted or enforced. And there is no great reason to not familiarize yourself with who your representative or your senator is. Get to know them. They may welcome any input that you have to offer.
And the follow-up, I just want to add one more thing. The contact is good, the do this or don't do this is good, but come back around at the end. Thank you, Representative Holcomb, for supporting increased funding to make sure my kids got less, students in their class, or Representative Holcomb, how could you vote against the budget to increase funding? These are made up examples, but you get what I'm saying. That follow through is really, really important. We don't do enough of that, I think, as advocates, and so being a good sort of citizen advocate, that can be really powerful.
And I'll just add to that as well, Jennifer, because we're here this evening in talks in preparation for the upcoming session, right, and how you can engage in, activity during that time. But again, to you all's point, it's so important even post-session to just remain in contact, continue to establish and build those relationships, those authentic relationships, so that, again, your voice is really heard.
Thank you all. I want to take time now to open it up to questions, both here in the room as well as from our viewers who are streaming.
So I'll start. I'll be the brave one. So you've given us the example of communicating with our own local representatives or state representatives, and that's. Scott Holcomb is my representative too. I'm perfectly comfortable. We need to talk. I'm perfectly comfortable communicating with him about what I think because I find him to be receptive to my ideas. There are other legislators that might not be as receptive to some of my ideas, and so what's the point? Sometimes I wonder what's the point in reaching out to my representative if I know that it's going to be a dead end to have that conversation. What's the benefit there?
And I'm going to repeat the question just to make sure that the folks that are remote heard that. But the question is, in essence, if you are going to, if you want to give feedback to a representative, but you don't think that they are going to be as receptive to your ideas as you might hope, what is the advice for how to handle that?
So I'll take that and say that all voices matter. And if your legislator, whether he or she agrees with you or disagrees with you, is inundated with telephone calls and emails, I think he or she will get the point that whatever legislation they're trying to pass, whether they agree with it or not, could end up potentially affecting them later on. I think it's important. And if we all sit back, it's sort of like the person who says, I'm not going to vote because my vote doesn't matter. Every vote matters. Every voice matters. And so if we are not all communicating our opinions consistently and inundating those legislatures with our ideas, whether they agree with them or not, then I don't think the point will get across.
And those who are remote, use the chat box, please, if you've got questions.
I will just add to that. There's legislators that are never going to agree with one organization or another on certain issues, but at some point, most legislators there will be an issue where you need them to be an ally, and they are ready to be an ally. So it's all about building that relationship and being able to have those constructive, respectful conversations. There are several legislators in the state capitol that we know are going to vote against our issues 99% of the time, but there's that 1% where it's going to be important that we had sit-downs, a couple times a year. We talk to them about the issues, and at some point there's going to be that issue that comes up, and they say, sign me up for that.
Since you're in the neighborhood, I've lived in this district for a really, really long time, and you might remember 2 cycles ago, Jill Chambers was the state representative, and at that time there was a big gun bill also up. This was a while ago now, about carrying guns on MARTA, and I took MARTA to work every day, and I knew she was going to vote for the bill, but we had a really long conversation, and I feel like even though she did not at all agree with my perspective as a constituent in her district, I felt like I was better to have this conversation and this debate again next time, because we were able to, to find a little bit of common ground in the language I was using, a little bit in the language she was using. She's not around anymore, but I felt like I grew as an advocate in that moment. And I know that that's not everybody's professional or personal goals, so I appreciate that. But for me, it was I don't get shaken anymore when I stand up for something I believe in after that conversation, because it was really hard.
Thank you all for your comments. This has been very enlightening. I wanted to follow up on the public comments piece. I forgot who mentioned it, but that to me was especially interesting because the state has to be responsive to those. And in line with the question that was just asked, how do I know that they're going to care that what I am saying matters? I think it would be great to get an example of a certain piece of legislation in which public comments did matter, because I know that if I went to my friends and said, or my family, and I said, comment on this, it's worth your time, I know what the response is going to be, why it doesn't matter. And I would love to be prepared with an example to say, actually, here's what it does.
And just to repeat and summarize, do you all have an example of when public comments have really made a difference, so that we can share that when we are talking with folks and trying to encourage them to take the time to comment?
So on the specific issue of healthcare, Kentucky and Arkansas currently have court cases over similar healthcare plans. And the judge in those cases put a hold on the implementation of both waivers and directly pointed to the record of the public comments. So in Arkansas, 16,000 people had lost health care coverage because Arkansas had put forward a waiver of a health care plan that looks a lot like Governor Kemp's plan. So so in that state, and they had a public comment period. People spoke up. They said this isn't going to work. Then there was data to show it didn't work, and the judge put a stop to it and pointed directly to the record of the public comments. So that's not legislation necessarily. This is a different kind of piece of the policy puzzle. It's called a healthcare waiver, but it does demonstrate, I think, the power of public comments.
I just want to add that whenever you have expertise on something and you can bring that to bear, it does make a difference. And sometimes your expertise is from your personal experience. You could be a survivor of violence, for example. Sometimes it's whatever you do in your profession or just an issue you know really well. And I have seen that countless times. When we were working on a bill a couple of years ago, we were in committee and we were seeing extensive misunderstanding among the committee members about the temporary protective order process and what that looks like and what the ex parte part of that is. Pure misinformation and misunderstanding of that. And we were able to bring people in just to simply very calmly walk through, here's exactly what happens. And we would want to bring in somebody that has been a part of that, either has represented a survivor through that as an advocate, or maybe even has gotten one themselves. And so I've seen that so many times that I just want to hit home, and that's why having women come to the Capitol or talk to their legislators is so important. There are so many issues where you are the expert, and the legislators simply do not know the information. And if you're able to bring that to bear, you can really make a difference.
Great.
Can you give the URL again? And is it for all bills or just the healthcare?
So for these two healthcare plans, the URL is coverga.org. That's coverga.org. Please go there between today and December 3rd is when the public comment period will close. It's only a 30-day window. That's for the state comment period. There will be federal comment periods too. So when we come back and ask you to comment again, it's not because we've forgotten that you commented the first time. Now, if you want to read up on bills during the legislative session, a good website to write down is legis.ga.gov. And you can search any and all bills that are filed down at the Capitol. A better way to do it is to instead just sign up for an email update from a group that you're interested in their issues. I think all of our groups have weekly email updates during the legislative session. Then those people will read the bills for you and translate them and tell you which ones are important. That's a lot easier than going to the website to read about the bills.
And some of the legislatures also send their updates throughout the session. So if you have, I know Elena Parent, for example, I'm not one of her constituents, but I receive her updates. So that's another way to keep yourself informed.
And we will disseminate information as well, the Public Affairs Committee under the GAWL at the Gold Dome. So you'll see those posts on social media coming up during the session, and also look for more information in your e-blasts. So we will be taking some of the information that we receive from these organizations and then even trying to distill that down more for the organization, in particular for perhaps things that we learn from the membership that they're in particular interested in hearing about. So, wonderful. Other questions here or online?
Can I ask a question of the group?
Yes, you can.
I think that I'll probably speak for all of us in that we would love to know what we as issue-based organizations can be doing better to engage people who are willing to come after a long day of work and sit here and listen to this stuff. Because we very much, I think, all are dedicated to broadening our sort of civic engagement work with communities and would love your advice on how to be better.
I'll just say a few things. I've come to this preview a couple years, and I always think, Ms. Owens, that you have one of the best, you've always presented really well. I think the whole entire concept of the budget and how that comes, money talks, right? So it's really important to understand where the money comes from and how it gets allocated. And I've always found that the things that you've said at these things have always been really important. In the past, you've come back with a bunch of different handouts that I've taken home to my husband, and he's like, oh, this is very interesting. And then he thinks about it, talks about it with his parents. And so I think it's just a matter of the fact that you guys do come out here every year and inform us, and then we all go home and give it to our spouse or to our children or to our neighbor or colleagues at work. And it does open those conversations. So I just want to say thank you.
Thank you.
But I love the handouts that you've brought in the past. I don't know if you brought any today.
We do.
They always have papers. They'll make fun of me.
Advocates love a paper.
Lots of papers.
There are handouts out front for those that are here in the room, and we're also going to provide electronic information via email after the event as well, so that everybody will have access to information, whether you're in the room or not.
I'll echo that as well. I think information is power, and especially with big data and analytics, the more like statistics and analytics that you can arm us with to be more informed and educated and better advocates, the better.
Great.
Can I ask a question?
Yes, you can.
That's fun. This is fun. Is there an issue that none of us brought up that you were hoping to hear about tonight? Or is there something you want to know? Do we think there might be a bill coming on in 2020?
Well, I had heard there was some comment about some cutbacks in the budget for the public defender's office. But then also in the same conversation, there was mention of just doing away with the death penalty. Have you heard any talks about that in terms of getting rid of the capital punishment, and in terms of reducing the state's budget?
And I'll just repeat the question. It is, has there been any talk about eliminating the death penalty, and in terms of how that could impact the budget as well as we're talking about these criminal justice cuts?
I know there are advocates that work on that, but I don't know that there is legislation being worked on that particular topic. But the bigger issue of criminal justice and criminal justice reform, there continue to be several initiatives that are being looked at. There is one, for example, to look at restoring the voting rights of felons once they have completed their sentence. And I have some hope that there is some movement behind that. And so hopefully we will see some continued movement along the lines of criminal justice reform. We in our state do have, actually we have seen some really impressive progress on that issue in recent years.
And I think that would be something that we would be paying attention to as well, as our organization does do work with incarcerated survivors. And so criminal justice reform would be something that we would be lending our ear to, and any advocacy efforts towards as well.
I would definitely watch the budget. I mean, this was a priority of Governor Deal's, and he did a lot of amazing work. And it remains unclear if this is also going to be a priority area for Governor Kemp. There's a lot happening on the budget side, and I think what you've heard around cuts to the criminal justice, just sort of programs generally, with public defenders being a part of that, is accurate, and I'm happy to share more specifics. I brought the current year budget primer, and at the very end, it actually shares some pretty surprising data around how much money we spend around correctional control, so folks on probation. It's a significant amount of money. We're one of the top states in the country for people under state supervision. So whatever that next leg of criminal justice looks like, whether that has kind of a state budget lens to it or not, that is an area that that we believe needs to be looked at, and that has lots of things tied up into it in terms of sort of keeping people in a position to not be able to sort of rebuild and restart their lives because of fines and fees and all the things that come with correctional control.
On the topic of criminal justice reform, I just wanted to put in another plug for something I was working on. I just wrapped up a fellowship with the Georgia Justice Project, and the big policy goal that we had and have is to try and change Georgia's expungement laws. So in Georgia, you're perpetually punished for a misdemeanor, felony, certain felonies, and it makes it so hard for all people, women especially. I had so many clients, women with kids, that couldn't get jobs because of their old records, and Georgia's law makes it very difficult to remove anything off of your record. So I know Georgia Justice Project is really going to be pushing. When I was there, we met with several legislators, and that's a topic. If you're interested, I highly encourage you to check out Second Chance Georgia. If you Google that, the website will pop up, or check out Georgia Justice Project.
Great. Any other questions?
Is there any legislation related to controls on vaping and restrictions on public vaping and all of that?
I am really glad you asked that question. She asked about vaping. I don't know that there's going to be any legislation on controls around vaping. Well, let me take that back. There's discussion right now about two things related to vaping. One is that, so vaping is a nicotine product, but it is not a tobacco product, which means we don't apply a tobacco tax to vaping. So we tax cigarettes and cigars and other tobacco products that I don't know anything about. But we don't tax vaping because it doesn't have tobacco in it. So there's a discussion of applying an equitable tax on vaping products as tobacco products, and that's important because young people are especially price sensitive, and so when you raise the price of a product that has harmful effects, fewer of them take it up. And what we're seeing is that vaping is not actually a tool to get people to stop smoking. What it does is introduce young people to smoking instead. So there's that discussion, and there's also a discussion about moving the age limit for purchase up to 21. That's a conversation that's happening at the federal and state level at the same time, and so I don't know who will move first, although it's way easier to get things done at the state than at the federal level. So I imagine that if Georgia's gonna move, they'll move first. But that conversation is just beginning. So that may very well come up because it's looking like a very bipartisan issue for 2021 or 2020. I don't know what year we're in.
But there, I guess, thank you for that, but I guess there's no limit or move to limit public exposure.
No, I haven't heard any discussion or seen any discussion of limiting where you can vape.
Wonderful. Well, thank you to all of our panelists tonight for a great conversation back and forth. That was it's always inspiring. And I think for me, one of the big takeaways is partnership, and that we hear our panelists talking about how they are, there's a lot of overlap between what they're working on, and there should be overlap in what we're all doing, right? And that when we do our piece, we are also overlapping, and that together we have a much bigger impact that we can make on the issues to move the needle forward for all citizens of Georgia, and in particular for women in our state. A couple of things I wanted to mention to you all, just so that you're aware. We have a couple of deadlines coming up. It's November 15th is the Leadership Academy deadline for applying, and the 22nd is the Mentoring Circle Statement application deadline. So if you're interested in participating in either of those, I encourage you. There's more information on GAWL's website, but there's still time to submit your application or your interest form and to get involved in that way as well. And I want now, if you guys would join me in just thanking our panelists this evening for a wonderful presentation. And thank you to everybody online. And there's still food